to the final lecture of Module 1. In this lecture, we're going to discuss how to evaluate emerging trends and technologies for use in K-12 virtual education. As usual, we have 2 lesson outcomes. First, we're going to discuss some practices and processes that you can implement for evaluating technologies and trends for use in your own classes. And then second, we're going to apply that criteria to an example technology, in this case Google Hangouts, so that you can learn how to then apply it in your own settings. But let's start with 4 dimensions of review. I like to think of 4 major areas of questions that you need to ask yourself when looking at a technology or trend to implement. Now, certainly there could be 3 areas, there could be 8 areas. It really depends on how you want to dissect your overall evaluation process. And I'm sure there are many more questions that you could be asking yourself than the ones I'm going to share with you today. And in fact, we're going to discuss those in the discussion forums this week. We're going to talk about what we would add to this list or how would we reorganize this list so that we can utilize these dimensions more effectively for our own reviews. But let's start with this. Let's use these 4 dimensions as our baseline. The first dimension is learning effectiveness. This is where we talk about how well does the technology or the trend actually affect positively the learning outcomes that I'm hoping to achieve. This is the appropriateness to the learning context. We talked about this in the first lecture of this module, and this is where we'll revisit that. The second dimension is functionality and technical requirements. This is where we want to talk about the actual usability of the technology and what's required in order to run the technology for use in my class. The third dimension is accessibility. This covers everything from ensuring all students have equal or relevant access to the technology, as well as protecting students' identities in the particular technologies or trends that you may be wanting to utilize. And then finally, the 4th dimension is the company or producer considerations. It's really important to think about where this technology is coming from and how will it be sustained into the future. And in this area, we'll discuss that. So let's start with learning effectiveness. And in fact, I like to phrase these evaluation criteria or metrics in the terms of questions that you would ask yourself as you're looking at that particular technology or thinking about implementing that trend. So what questions will we ask ourselves around learning effectiveness? I think we would want to start by asking ourselves, is this tool really relevant, uniquely appropriate to the goals of my learning activity? And then similarly, are the skills that are emphasized in utilizing this tool relevant to the learning outcomes? So in other words, I'm asking myself, is this tool appropriate to my discipline, to the content? And does it actually give students, a chance to acquire the skills necessary in that particular discipline to be able to problem solve or critically analyze a situation? Next, I want to ask myself, could this tool actually improve learning? Is this going to help students get more in depth into a concept or understand a concept in a better way? Is this going to help students apply or create their own examples of this concept in their environments? And will this tool engage students in a either new way or in a more effective way? Can we see students be more excited or passionate about the activity because of the use of the technology or the trend? And then finally, will this tool provide me with insight into how well my students are doing? Does this tool actually expose my students' strengths and weaknesses? Does it help me understand where my students need further learning and where they are very sufficient or capable in meeting the particular learning objectives or outcomes I have set forth? Like I said, this is just a short list. We could go on and on about how effective a tool is as in relation to the learning that I'm hoping to happen with use of that tool or technology. But let's move on to functionality and technical requirements. So if I'm thinking about the actual technology itself or the implementation of a particular trend, I need to be thinking about how available is this tool or the approach that's implemented through the trend. Are there copyright concerns I need to address? Is this tool free? Or if not, if it is for cost, is it a cost that I can bear, or that my students can bear, or that my institution can bear? And will that either free element or that cost remain consistent down the road? Let's say I want to use this tool semester after semester, or I want to implement it into a longer term program or capstone project. Will I be able to use this tool into the future without having to worry about it costing more or disappearing? Is the tool actually intuitive to use? Will my students be able to easily use it without having me to provide them with a lot of instruction or direction? We want the focus to be on the learning activity, not on the technology or the tool or the approach. And so will this tool allow me to focus on the learning as opposed to that technology or tool? How will my students learn how to use the actual tool? Will I be able to send them to tutorials and resources? Will I be able to teach them and incorporate that in the class? Or can they teach themselves? Or better yet, do they already know how to use the tool or technology? If I need to administer the tool, so let's say I need to actually run the tool, is this easy? Do I have access to the appropriate resources to do so? Do I have access to the appropriate technologies to do so? Do I have the knowledge or the expertise or the support within my institution to help me administer this tool? And finally, can I monitor student work? This, as important to learning effectiveness, is also important to the technology itself. Will I be able to see the data? Can I see the results? Can I export the data? Can I put it into my gradebook? Can I incorporate it in other tools? Can I use the data for analysis? And can I do all of this in a secure manner? Now, this leads to some accessibility concerns or questions that I need to be asking myself about technologies. Can my students equally access the tool and or a relevant equivalent if they have a disability? Are there vehicles for captions and transcripts and the capability to use assistive technologies available for this particular tool? Do I need to worry about students' bandwidth? Do I need to worry about their internet access? Should I be concerned about any special equipment that's required for them to utilize the tool or technology or to participate in the innovative approach implemented by the trend? If the tool is a public resource, if it's publicly available to anyone that wants to use it, do I have ways to protect my students' identities if I wish? Can students create independent accounts separate from their personal accounts in these technologies so that they can manage their learning environment separate from their personal environment? Or if not, if I want them to be operating in their personal environment, can I enable it so that they can protect some personal information while exposing others while utilizing this tool in the learning activities that I am creating? Is the tool scalable, stable, and reliable? In other words, can the tool support multiple students? Can it support the kind of growth that I may have in my course or my program or at my institution? Is it stable? Is it always available? Is it up? Do I have to worry about 2, 3, 4 weeks on end where the tool may not be available and I have to have an alternate approach to my learning activity? And is it reliable? Does it perform quickly? Do I not have to worry about large lag times? Or do I not have to worry about bugs or broken features coming and going frequently while I'm using the tool? And then finally, are there appropriate help resources for me to utilize the tool as well as my students? Can they easily access these resources? Do they have places to go if they have questions? How can they support one another in the use of this tool in the most effective manner? Well, this of course leads to then the company or producer or provider of the technology or tool, or the technologies or tools that are embedded in the trend that you're evaluating. So you do need to ask yourself, is this tool provided by a third party? And if so, is that provider actually stable? Is that company going to be around? Is that individual who's created the tool available for support for that tool in an ongoing fashion? Are there provisions for that tool to be supported indefinitely and even enhanced? What happens to bugs? Will things be fixed? Will I be able to provide feedback to the provider or the company about how I'd like to see the tool improve in order to support the learning activities that I am doing most effectively? If the tool is open source, and for those of you that don't know what open source means, when I say open source, I reference open code that you can then utilize and change based on community permissions, so that you can use it in very particular ways within your class, school, program, or institution. So if a tool is open source, can I manage it? Do I have the technical capabilities? Do I want to change it? Should I change it? Do I have the staff around me to help me support this open source tool? Open source tools are very compelling and very exciting because quite often they're free and they give us the ability to make a tool very specific to what we want it to do, but they do require technical support and ongoing considerations. Am I ready to invest that kind of support and time into the future? Can this tool or technology plug into other things I use, particularly my learning environment or my virtual learning space? Am I able to integrate it, pass data, pass identities, be able to link to it from other places, even incorporate seamless identification or authentication processes? These may not be critical, but these may be important in some cases, depending on how much I'm using that technology and how safe and secure I want to make sure that technology is. And then finally, are there best practices and examples available that I can utilize, that I can access, that I can contribute to about how to use this tool or technology or how to implement this trend within virtual education? Are there other people doing similar things that I can talk to, communicate with, learn from? So now that we've thought through these 4 dimensions, let's take a second to ask ourselves or reflect on what we've just learned. As part of a virtual program, so I'm in a virtual program, my students now have access to iPads. I personally am looking for an application for my students that's focused on learning world geography. I'm a history teacher and I have some components of geography in my class and think that there could be some really innovative and engaging ways for students to play with applications to learn geography in new ways. But when I'm looking at applications, there may be things that are going to keep me from specifically selecting an application. What might those be? Okay, now that we've thought about what might keep me from utilizing a technology, let's actually apply those concepts and the 4 dimensions to a real-world example. In this case, let's talk about Google Hangouts. For those of you unfamiliar with Google Hangouts is a way to synchronously connect students with one another, or you with your students, in a synchronous voice over IP fashion. It's also a way that you can present to the world. There are ways to allow people to come listen to a lecture synchronously that you're providing from Google Hangouts as well. If you've never used Google Hangouts or haven't checked it out, I do encourage you to go take a look and play around with it. It's a pretty easy tool to use. Well, speaking of the fact that it's a pretty easy tool, let's talk about some of its strengths relative to those 4 dimensions. Google Hangouts, well, it's clearly from a very stable company, Google, and the company has been supporting Google Hangouts for quite some time now, at least over 2 years, and has explicitly communicated plans to continue to support and enhance Google Hangouts. There are quite a few examples. There's some really good, robust sites that you can look at to see how to use Google Hangouts in K-12 education. And in fact, I've included a couple of those in our resource list for this week. Your students' identities can be secure in Google Hangouts. All they need is a Google Plus account, and they can create multiple Google Plus accounts. So you could have your students create a separate Google Plus account for their learning activities that you're conducting that's different from their personal Google Plus account. Google Hangouts is very good for small group project-based learning. In fact, I conducted with my students group sessions where we work through problems, we work through cases, we prepare a project, and then I have my students come and present to the larger audience through Google Hangouts their final projects. There's ample help documentation within Google Hangouts as well. Lots of resources that you can use and your students can use to get better information on how to use the tool. It's fairly intuitive to use and it's free, which is definitely an advantage. And there's minimal administration on your part as the instructor. Really, all you need to do is coach students to create a Google Plus account and then create a Hangout for them to come join you. Pretty simple and easy. So there's a lot of strengths to using Google Hangouts. But there may also be some challenges with using it that you should be aware of. First of all, when we talked about requiring external equipment, it does require a good headset and a stable internet connection because it is using voice over IP to connect both the audio and the video of each individual student participating in the Hangout. Now, Google Hangouts can be integrated in some platforms. There are Google Apps for Education that probably many of you are aware of, but there might be some cost associated with that depending on what application you're trying to integrate it with and how you want that integration to work. Now, participation data, that's an interesting element to think about when we're looking at Google Hangouts. You can record your Hangouts and you can record chat logs. So that's good. So you could go back and reference student participation in both of those ways. But actual activity, time and duration in a Hangout, and data like that is a little harder to get at through Google Hangouts. So it might be a little harder to assess student activity. And then finally, there are some limitations on scalability. If you want to have a group of students come together both with audio and video, pretty much after about 10, you start to degrade the overall experience, and sometimes students have a hard time staying connected. Once again, it's also heavily reliant on a good internet connection, and so depending on where you're having your students connect from, that can also degrade the experience. Now, you can present to a larger audience, but that will then mute the audio and the video of the students that are receiving that presentation, which might not necessarily be advantageous to your particular learning activity. So that's a way to apply these 4 dimensions to a particular technology. I do think as we looked at this, Google Hangouts is probably a very good tool. The strengths definitely outweigh the challenges for use in a project-based or team-based activity. So let's reflect on this and ask ourselves a final question. Back to my world geography search, and I'm looking for applications to use on the iPad that can help students best learn world geography in an engaging manner. So now I've narrowed it down to 3 choices, but I want to pick just one. Which of the following do you think is the best choice for me to implement?